Over and over again, Africa is reminded why trusting the West is a dangerous gamble. The latest example comes from Ghana, where something remarkable happened. For the first time in recent memory, the Ghanaian cedi outperformed the US dollar and became the best-performing currency in the world. It should have been a moment of national pride, a victory worth celebrating. But instead of applauding, the International Monetary Fund stepped in with a warning. Rather than congratulating Ghana, the IMF accused the Bank of Ghana of manipulating the market, alleging that the central bank was pumping money into the economy to artificially boost the currency's strength. That raises the bigger question: why does the IMF care so much about Ghana's success? Is it suddenly a crime for an African currency to rise? Should Ghana take this warning seriously? Or is it simply another tactic of control hidden behind the mask of financial advice? The late Dr. Arikana Chihambori Kwao, former African Union ambassador to the US, once made a bold statement that shook her audience. She said institutions like the IMF and World Bank survive by keeping African countries trapped in cycles of loans they can never fully repay. Their model, she argued, depends on African failure because their success is tied to dependency. Ghana's situation today seems to echo her words. Think about what a stronger currency really means for ordinary citizens. A stable or rising cedi lowers import costs, helps reduce inflation, and makes life a little easier for families struggling to survive. Yet the IMF insists this is a problem. How ironic is that? When African currencies collapse, they preach about reforms and austerity. But the moment an African nation begins to succeed, suddenly there's panic. The IMF's warning didn't stop at accusations. They told Ghana to allow the free market to determine the currency's strength and stop intervening. To make matters worse, some Ghanaian officials even echoed those words, claiming the rise of the cedi wasn't real but a temporary effect of central bank policies. But again, the question lingers: why should the IMF be so worried about Ghana's progress? Isn't their stated mission to help stabilize economies? If Ghana finds a path that strengthens its currency and brings relief to its people, why should that be seen as a threat? The uncomfortable truth is that the global financial system was never built for Africa to win. Looking at the IMF's history in Africa, the pattern becomes clear. Decades of programs and so-called structural adjustments have left behind a trail of collapsed industries, massive debts, and weakened currencies. Not once has an IMF plan brought true economic independence to any African nation. Ghana's small victory in strengthening its currency is proof that success outside the IMF's playbook is possible, and that's exactly why it makes them uneasy. To understand how much this moment means, it helps to look back at Ghana's recent struggles. Under previous leadership, the country faced one of its worst economic crises in decades. Debt soared, inflation skyrocketed, and the cedi lost value at a painful pace. Ordinary Ghanaians bore the brunt of it all. When John Mahama returned to power, he inherited this broken economy. One of his first moves was bold. He scrapped a series of unpopular taxes that had been introduced under IMF pressure. These included levies on mobile money transfers, vehicle insurance (VAT), and even a tax on small-scale miners. The IMF had demanded these taxes as part of a bailout agreement, but they only deepened the suffering of ordinary people. By removing them, the government hoped to ease the burden on households and give businesses room to breathe. Critics questioned how the government would make up for the lost revenue, but officials argued that easing the pressure on citizens was the first step toward recovery. Finance Minister Cassiel Edo-Forson told Parliament that these cuts would help improve disposable incomes, support business growth, and stabilize the economy. The government also introduced spending cuts and tax reforms to increase revenue collection. Combined with new initiatives like reintroducing road tolls under an infrastructure program, Ghana began to rebuild confidence. Slowly, the economy started to stabilize, inflation began to cool, and the cedi strengthened. By 2025, it had even surpassed the US dollar to become the world's top-performing currency. This should have been celebrated as a breakthrough moment. Instead, the IMF criticized it. Why? Because Ghana was succeeding without following their instructions. Because Ghana dared to cut IMF-backed taxes and still managed to come out stronger. That's the uncomfortable reality. The IMF doesn't design policies to make African countries thrive. It designs them to ensure reliance. If you doubt that, just look at Egypt. For years, Egypt has followed the IMF's playbook to the letter, agreeing to painful reforms in exchange for loans. In 2024, Egypt signed an $8 billion agreement with the IMF. On paper, it looked like salvation. In practice, it meant removing subsidies on essentials like fuel and electricity, letting the currency float freely, and exposing millions of ordinary Egyptians to unbearable costs. Prices of food and fuel skyrocketed, electricity bills doubled, and wages failed to keep pace. The result was suffering, not stability. By mid-2024, Egypt saw bread prices soar by 300% after subsidies were cut, while fuel prices rose 3 times in just 1 year. Instead of prosperity, the IMF deal pushed Egypt further into economic despair, forcing citizens to pay the price of dependency. This contrast explains why Ghana's success story unsettles the IMF. An African nation proving that it can rise without following Western-dictated prescriptions threatens the very system that keeps these institutions relevant. A strong, independent Africa challenges the foundation of global financial control. And that is the truth they don't want the world to see. The situation in Egypt is devastating. Poverty has surged close to 30%. The local currency has lost nearly half its value against the US dollar, and inflation has climbed to over 33%. This crisis is not only breaking ordinary families, it's draining the state itself. President Sisi has admitted publicly that Egypt lost between $6 and $7 billion in revenue in less than a year, and expects the bleeding to continue. Across the country, anger is boiling. People are furious, accusing their leaders of failing to protect them from the crushing spiral of poverty. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This crisis didn't appear overnight. It's the result of years of austerity measures tied to International Monetary Fund programs, policies that Egypt's leaders accepted and enforced. And now, even President Sisi is hinting at a drastic possibility, moving away from IMF conditions and seeking alternatives. That brings us to a deeper question, one every African nation must face. If IMF programs often end in economic collapse, why do our governments continue signing onto them? The answer is both simple and tragic. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Egypt all need money to keep their economies afloat. And when they seek help, they almost always turn to institutions like the IMF and World Bank. These institutions didn't just appear yesterday. They were created after World War II with stated missions that sounded noble. The World Bank promised to rebuild devastated economies and reduce poverty. The IMF promised to stabilize currencies and protect the global monetary system. But behind the glossy brochures lies a different reality. These organizations were designed by the West for the West. Every loan, every policy, and every reform is rooted in Western ideology, carefully crafted to protect Western interests. And this is where the real trap begins. When the IMF or World Bank lends money, it's never just money. It comes with strings attached. Those strings aren't just about financial management. They reach into culture, politics, and sovereignty. Want proof? Look at Uganda. After its government passed an anti-gay law, the World Bank blocked access to loans worth billions. But the conditions go beyond cultural issues. The most destructive strings are economic. They come in the form of what experts call neoliberal conditionalities, strict economic rules that countries must adopt before receiving funds. On paper, these policies sound logical, but in practice, they tear nations apart. They require slashing government spending, even on vital services like health and education. They demand privatization of state companies, stripping governments of control over critical industries. They push for subsidy cuts that make basic necessities unaffordable. They enforce market liberalization, throwing fragile local markets into direct competition with powerful global corporations. And perhaps most damaging of all, they pressure countries to devalue their currencies and let them float, triggering inflation and making imports impossibly expensive. These exact policies gutted Egypt's economy. And if history teaches us anything, they've left devastation across Africa for decades. So the question remains, are these loans a lifeline or are they a noose tightening around Africa's neck? The truth is, these policies didn't suddenly appear. They were introduced decades ago during Africa's earliest years of independence, when nations were vulnerable and searching for stability. Back then, the IMF and World Bank sold these conditions as structural adjustment programs, supposed miracle cures for struggling economies. African governments believed the promises, embraced the reforms, and were left with disaster. Subsidies vanished, state industries were dismantled, local markets were flooded with foreign corporations, and incomes collapsed. Poverty and stagnation replaced growth and opportunity. Worst of all, the door was left wide open for Western multinationals to exploit Africa under the guise of foreign investment. Even when countries abandoned these programs later, the damage was already done. Decades later, the same prescriptions are still being forced on African nations. The same bitter medicine is given, despite the fact that it has never worked. By definition, that's insanity, doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result. Or maybe it's not insanity at all. Maybe it's by design. Because the truth many don't want to admit is this: these institutions were never meant to liberate Africa. They were created to keep Africa dependent. And the evidence is everywhere. Each time a nation shows signs of standing on its own feet, the rug is pulled out from under it. The IMF and World Bank continue to market themselves as saviors, claiming their mission is to eradicate poverty. Yet their legacy is filled with more poverty-stricken nations than any other modern institutions. Some economists even call them the greatest scam of the century. Look again at Egypt. Since 2017, it has been one of the IMF's largest clients. In less than a decade, the country borrowed nearly $30 billion through multiple IMF programs. But the loans didn't just pile up debt. They handed control of Egypt's economy over to the IMF itself, which pushed more borrowing from private lenders and foreign investors. For the past 7 years, the IMF has been the architect of Egypt's economic policies. And what has been the result? More debt, more poverty, more inflation, and a collapsing currency. Even so, the IMF still claims its programs in Egypt were a success. They point to external shocks, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, rising global interest rates, even the Gaza conflict, as the culprits for Egypt's collapse. But the numbers tell a different story. Egypt's poverty rate surged to over 32% after fully implementing IMF reforms. Hunger reached levels not seen in decades, with millions unable to afford basic food. External debt more than doubled, climbing from $55 billion in 2016 to over $160 billion by 2023. Short-term repayments alone reached $51 billion, more than the country's entire foreign reserves. Meanwhile, the Egyptian pound ranked among the world's worst currencies. These aren't random misfortunes. They're the direct results of IMF policies that were supposed to reform, but instead wrecked an entire nation's economy. Egypt is not alone. Its story is one chapter in a larger pattern repeated across Africa. And that pattern reveals a clear truth. These institutions are not tools of rescue. They are tools of control. If Africa wants real progress, it cannot keep walking down this same road. It must search for alternatives, create homegrown solutions, and work with partners who respect its sovereignty rather than exploit its weaknesses. Because if the IMF and World Bank truly wanted African countries to thrive, we would not be seeing poverty, hunger, and collapse on this scale today. So the question now belongs to the people and their leaders. Should Africa continue to bow to Western-led financial institutions, or is it time to finally walk away and claim independence?